Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear myself. Good evening and welcome. I think most of you are Jelinek. I'm the Divisional Dean of the Center for Global Affairs. Those of you who were with us for this semester's first session with Alexis Gelber, Newsmakers, Perspectives in Global Media, already know that you're in for an evening that will prompt new thoughts and perspectives on how stories are covered and news is made. Tonight's program relates directly not only to what is happening in the world, but also to our work here at the Center for Global Affairs. You've always heard me say this, is thriving. Robust graduate and non-credit programs and more on the way for spring. Public events as described in preview, which I hope you will read carefully, address timely issues of our day with guests drawn from media, non-governmental organizations, national organizations, private sector, and much more, and governments as well. The season began with sessions on Russia, energy pipeline, Syrian war crimes. Faculty and students are working on individual and research capstones focused on terrorism, energy, environment, and much more. News from current students and from alumni reach us almost daily with reports on their work in this country as well as in Malawi, Burma, China, Bolivia, and other places. Related to tonight's program is our work in peace building. One of our faculty, Tom Hill, who can't be here with us tonight, has been leading in Iraqi Kurdistan, which I had the good fortune to visit in January. We have an amazing team. I'm faculty, and an amazing team of administrators. And they always disappear, but it's Alice Eckstein, who's walking in back of that, who's managing the streaming, Corey Epstein, who's not in the room, and many, many more. And so I stand up here, but really they're the ones who make everything work. Back to Alexis. She asks, are they simply reporting the news, or does their reportage affect outcomes? And what is happening to media as journalists turn to non-traditional media? Today's program, which Alexis will introduce, touches on these and also brings insights on what went wrong with Iraq and what led to the rise of ISIS or IS. You have Alexis's program, so let me just give you a very brief highlights. An award-winning editor and journalist, experience in digital and print media. At Newsweek, she supervised coverage of politics, social issues, and international news. In 2009, she became the founding books editor at the Daily Beast. In spring 2011, she was a fellow at Harvard's Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Policy. And that's a really brief outline. There's more, so just revert to your program. Happily for us, she's back with us for yet another season of conversations. Please welcome Alexis, who will introduce FRONTLINE's Aronson and Martin Smith, who are our guests tonight.
Thank you, Vera. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. Thank you, Vera, for that very kind introduction. I am thrilled to be here tonight with two of the absolute standout documentary journalists in our profession. And let me just introduce them briefly. Raney Aronson is the Deputy Executive Producer for Frontline. She guides the development of all their series, from primetime TV broadcasts to many of the multi-platform initiatives that they're now doing. With executive producer David Fanning, she oversees all production and she runs daily editorial management of the series, as well as Frontline's new monthly magazine program, which I believe you created. Yes. Okay, under her leadership, Frontline has expanded the range and reach of long-form documentary journalism with innovative approaches, all the while maintaining journalistic excellence that has won Frontline countless awards. Martin Smith has a very distinguished career of reporting and producing. He has literally covered the world, from the revolutions in Central America to the fall of communism in Russia to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the global financial meltdown. He started his career at CBS. He worked at Frontline, he went to ABC, and in 1998 he founded Rain Media, which produces programming for ABC and Frontline. Martin has won every conceivable award in broadcast journalism. Most recently, he won the John Chancellor Award from Columbia Journalism School for his, and I quote, courageous and insightful reporting on some of the most complex stories of our time. You're about to see that tonight in the discussion of the rise of ISIS, which is a film that just debuted last night on PBS and which you will be able to see some clips of tonight. We'll be talking about the story of that film. And I think it is also available in other ways that you'll hear about as well. So I wanted to just start by asking Raney about Frontline of ISIS. You guys have been so prescient about this story. I remember when we were talking early in the summer about your coming here, you were talking about all of the initiatives you had going. And before ISIS was even a word in the vocabulary of American news consumers, you were already on the case. Can you sort of talk about what led you to sort of focus on this story so?
Thanks, and it's great to be here. It's great so many people come to talk about this. I think that's half the battle, is getting people to pay attention to these issues. So this is amazing to see you guys here. I would say one of the things I want to just put into context is Frontline does a lot of collaborations, and that means we work with other news organizations. And in this case, I really want to shout out Roy is an amazing print journalist who works for McClatchy. And he came to us actually almost a year ago to say, you know, there's this group, they're calling themselves ISIS. Have you heard of them? We said, talking about, and he started to tell us about this. And then he started to publish very small stories that you really wouldn't have noticed. They were certainly not on the front page of the New York Times, for example. They weren't getting into any big conversation, but we were paying attention because we know Roy very well. And over the months, we decided that we needed to look at this. And I think it was one of the best decisions we made editorially. And trust me, these are decisions that aren't just made by me. These are decisions made by myself, David Fanning, Andrew Metz, the sort of small editorial team at Frontline. And we decided to start looking at however would we get inside Syria. And at the time, it was impossible to send somebody like Martin into Syria. There was no way we would have done it. And we have very strict security protocol when we talk about that. But there was a local journalist that we've worked with on 2 other stories about Syria, which we have done a lot of reporting on. It's a story that I care deeply about. We started reporting on this very early on. And this guy's name is Muhammad Ali. He is so heroic. He's Syrian himself. And he started to email us and said, you know, I think I can get across the border. And I think I can get in, but I need to go alone. And we said, what do you mean? You can't go alone. You have to go with security. He said, I don't want security. It's going to get me killed. I can go. He has, you know, very close relationships with the people who brought him across the border. And we were convinced that it was the safest way to actually get the story. And what he found was, I think the best thing to do is actually show you a clip, and it's important for you to watch the part about ISIS. And then I want to tell you a remarkable story about how we verified the reporting that he did when he was inside Syria, which was not, by the way. So we'll show you, it's a couple of minutes, and you can take a quick look if you missed this on Frontline. Well, they get it going. more. I mean, one of the most important things to say is these local reporters, oftentimes are called fixers in our language. These local reporters risk their lives daily for news organizations around the world, and rarely do you see their faces. I mean, I really can't even quite tell you how heroic they are, and Marty can talk himself about how much he's worked with local people and local journalists. So Muhammad decided show his face, and he decided he wanted to take a step forward as a person who was identifiable, and that was an important step for him the time he's done this.
You see back here?
We're producers, so hold on, we got to get this right. Okay, sorry.
The most radical of the jihadist factions to turn against the other rebels is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS. The group wants to establish an Islamic State in Syria. It claims Al-Qaeda, but even Al-Qaeda has severed ties with them.
They're swearing their allegiance to ISIS. So the subtitles were missing on that, but they were swearing their allegiance to ISIS, essentially being forced to. So That was the first time we had heard of ISIS, and we put it out in the spring, so this is way ahead of Mosul, and it's really because of Muhammad. But the most amazing part of this story was that you saw the map where you saw that amazing line that's happened inside Syria, and you guys have seen a lot of this lately, so that's actually an old map now because it comes from the spring, so they've spread their control has spread very significantly. But to the point of this series, we worked with our at Frontline to actually try to track the spread of ISIS once we heard of them. And we were really desperately curious, how big is this? How do we verify this? And we worked with some local researchers who will never let us talk about who they are, identify them in public. But they're very, very solid researchers. We've used them in the past. And they helped us actually track that map. We were able to make a map from these people who were local, who were going town by town by documenting, filming, and actually loading a lot of this stuff on YouTube surreptitiously identification. And we were able to create a sense of what ISIS was about to look like and how it was going to spread. So that's because we have incredible investigative reporters on our own digital team who took that initiative. Not just the films we make anymore, it's the incredible work that's happening all around us that helps supplement it. And then it's incredible because it makes it into the film, and we reported, you know, ISIS is here, ISIS is coming, and pay attention. And that did as a consequence of being able to show the observational work that we did. And you see how you see it's shaky, right? But that's a guy person essentially saying this is big. And so that's really the journalism behind this story.
And when did that air?
That aired in the spring. So it aired, I think it was March or April.
Very early. So
Can I just add something about that particular footage there? That a lot of what we ISIS is comes from their own rather ample propaganda network. This is one of the very rare glimpses of an independent taking pictures. There was also on Vice Television or other sensational series that featured some inside footage of ISIS, but it was done under conditions that were agreed upon by the reporter to only show what ISIS wanted them to see. This is unique in that it's the real deal, done by an independent reporter who snuck in and took great risk to do it.
I don't have anything else like it as far as I can tell. So this is Muhammad's work. It's pretty profound, and it really shows how they're forcing the local people. First of all, you see the massacre that happened, and that was loaded onto YouTube, widely available and verifiable. But that's stuff that he got. Marty's right. You know, he really went there. I mean, and as you watch the film, you'll see, you know, he was shot leaving, and the guy who's driving the car said, "They always shoot. Don't worry about it." Like zoom, they left.
Just their way of
after this aired?
Increasingly, no, and he's continuing us. I mean, he really has not felt personal danger. Why that would be, I wish he was here, but he's worth it that he was able to get the story out about ISIS, that nobody was listening to him or that's part of the story of a lot of local reporters is they talk about this locally, but once they get, especially the American media or the British media, right, then the story megaphones out, so he felt it was worth it.
So I'd like to turn to Martin about his film, which is really phenomenal. If you haven't seen it yet, you should. It's absolutely chilling. I think the son called it harrowing. It is law called it, you know, terrifying. And it was really just kind of puts a spotlight, I think, on the questions that we all have as, you know, sort of consumers of news and people who are interested in the world. How did ISIS rise so quickly? Why are they so brutal? And who is to blame for all of this? So, Martin, why don't you talk a little bit about how this came to be? You said it has the backstory to this.
Well, first of all, let me say that I had heard of ISIS before April of 2013 because the group hadn't named itself ISIS. They went by the Islamic State of Iraq before that, wasn't very widely picked up. That it was AQI or Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They were originally an Al-Qaeda franchise. So in April of 2013, they started calling themselves the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham. Al-Sham refers to Greater Syria or the Levant. This is why you hear the president talk about ISIL, Iraq and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or you hear ISIS, Iraq and Al-Sham. Interestingly, the beginning of this story was that David Fanning, the executive producer, called me up in kind of alarm as we all were witnessing the fall of Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, and he said, "What are we going to do about the fall of Mosul?" And I thought, well, do you mean the country or do you mean Frontline? And of course, he both. But I had done a lot of work. I have done a lot of work in Iraq starting in 2003, right after the fall of the statue in central Baghdad, and have made 4 films there. And so it was natural that David would ask, interested in going back and putting together a story about what was unfolding. And it was very much an unfolding story. In fact, I thought, oh, perhaps by the time late October rolls around and we go on the air, Mosul will be retaken by some kind of effort by the Iraqi security. I didn't know at that time how rotten the Iraqi security forces had become and how incapable they were of taking back control. So the idea was I had to limit myself because I knew I couldn't go to the front lines. I couldn't go to where ISIS was fighting successfully or safely. But there was a whole backstory about their development, about Al-Qaeda in Iraq and how it became eventually ISIS, and what were the social conditions in both Iraq and Syria that gave birth or that promoted ISIS agenda, both in Iraq and in Syria. And at the same time, it's interesting because one of the first people I called at Raney's suggestion was Muhammad Ali, the reporter you just saw, the brave reporter we just saw inside Syria. And he was trying very hard to get inside one of the tribes. One of the things that a lot of people talk about ISIS is that they're really made up of 3 large groups. One is hardcore Islamic extremists on the one hand, former Ba'athists from the regime of Saddam, military officers with experience, many of them, which contributes to their acumen, as well as tribes, tribal leaders from the Sunni heartland of Anbar, Nineveh, and Saladin provinces in north and western Iraq. And Muhammad Ali was trying very hard to get himself embedded with one of the leading tribesmen who could give him shelter and get him close to ISIS. And after many sincere and skillful attempts, that he was not able to do that. So I was left with the idea that I would go in and examine the conditions that had to emerging. And the story begins in 2011 as American troops are leaving. And they give the keys to Iraq to Nouri al-Maliki, and he's now on his own. And he begins he begins a purge of anyone and everyone that he perceives as a potential threat to his power. It was aspirational that the president at the time said that we were handing over an Iraq that's largely cured of its ills, that we were leaving Maliki in charge of a democratic, inclusive Iraq. Those are the president's words. The consensus of the country was that we didn't want to have anything more to do with Iraq, but in fact it was a dangerous handoff to a man who had deep-seated paranoia about all sorts of Sunnis coming to take him out of power. So his sectarianism contributed to popular demonstrations, tens of thousands of people that you can see in the film taking to the streets. These demonstrations are met with more repression. They're met with gunfire, with the slaughter of Sunni peaceful protesters, to people being, of course, not just marginalized, but radicalized. There's another, and we'll get to it in 1 second. The other thing that contributed to ISIS rising was, and this is true of all insurgencies, need for sanctuary. Any successful guerrilla movement or insurgency, such as the Taliban using Pakistan as sanctuary, or in the case of the use of Syria. They move a few people into Syria, really a handful, maybe a couple of dozen, and they form a unit there called the NEWSMAKERS. Now, like that's a local Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria, and they begin to they're very smart about how they begin to take over assets. And we should go to the clip, I think, because I'm now stepping on, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's show the clip. This is a little bit of their experience in Syria and how it is that they got so rich and powerful. Let me scoot around. I forgot that this clip didn't begin with an explanation of how they came into Syria and immediately started to rob banks, seize oil fields, run extortion rackets, tax the local population. There's a scene that we show of them taking over a very large power station so that they could then charge for electricity. They began millions of dollars a day from oil, from taxation, from extortion. And so it was on the back of that explanation that we came to these, the ambassador who was urging the president, if you don't get involved here, we're going to have Al-Qaeda, yet, become more dominant. The president's taking the position, I think, that what he saw was not an imminent threat. Nobody wanted to get involved in the Syrian war, at least at the highest levels of the administration. So there was great reluctance to do anything to arm Syrian rebels for the reasons that we see here, even though his defense secretary, his secretary of state, Hillary Clinton, David Petraeus, the head of the CIA, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, all were pressing, including the ambassador who resigned over this very issue when he said, yeah, I can't serve this president if he's not going to arm moderate rebels.
Do you think that the president was overreacting to the sense of war weariness on the part of the public? How political was that decision?
Well, it really goes to what is our role in the world. And the president had assessed that unless there was an imminent threat to the U.S., it wasn't perhaps such a good idea to muck around in the Middle East any more than we had. We were 0 for 20. I'd say, in all our adventures in that part of the world. So I don't know if I would say that he was overreacting to war weariness. He simply had a different idea of what our role in the world should be. And you can argue with that. We pressed the White House for more voices. They were very reticent. The interview with Ben Rhodes, brother is named David, with Ben Rhodes came very late in the day. Within 2 weeks of air, we still didn't have somebody from the White House talking, and it was a lot of pressure to get them to talk. And finally, they did.
This is an administration that is not particularly friendly to the press.
Yeah, I haven't seen a presidency yet that was friendly to the press, but I'm not sure that if I were in the White House that I would be friendly to the press either. We can be a pain in the ass. Should be.
Yeah. So, in the making of this film, did you how much personal risk? Obviously, you weren't going into Syria. How much personal risk did you feel, even in you were back?
Sure. Well, just to go into Baghdad and to get what I got from other journalists and people that had recently come from there. I also made phone calls to people, cameramen on the ground. I was quite concerned. In Baghdad had stepped up, and the number of kidnappings had stepped up. And arrived, I moved into a house that I rented for my crew. We're a very small team. But we had rented a house, and I went out to buy groceries. And that very night, the had been shopping in was bombed. So there was concern, but it's part of the job. I'd be crazy to say that I wasn't nervous or apprehensive. On the other hand, I had told Raney and David that, look, I'm not going in to be a war hero here. I'm not going in to go on the front lines. I'm going in order to talk to politicians. And what you don't see in this clip is that a large part of the documentary actually talks to officials, and that was something I thought was doable.
It's always a really difficult decision on our behalf. And the one thing about Rain Media and Martin is they have an incredible security apparatus around them. So they're like a well-oiled machine. So every single day we would get an update, actually twice a day. We would get an update about Martin's whereabouts. In fact, we were texting most of the time he was gone. Whenever I started to feel queasy, I would text him. And usually within about 15 minutes, I would hear from him. So we were worried, though. I've said actually publicly that it was the only time I've actually actively worried about Martin. It was so unpredictable what was going to happen.
I wonder if you
It was as well. We were both very.
I wonder if you could both talk a little bit about the difference between. This is an aspect of working for a serious, well-staffed news organization. I certainly saw this when I was at Newsweek, and the kind of support that we gave our correspondents and the kinds of precautions that we took and the kind of training we gave them, the kinds of insurance that we had to have, as opposed to in the case of some of these freelance journalists who met with very different kinds of fates. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the different.
I'll start out. Well, war coverage is seen by a lot of young journalists as a gateway to a career. It's one place where you can take yourself on your own recovery and make a mark and come back with a report that nobody else is getting. And so the temptation, the reward is terrific. The risk is huge. And the biggest problem that I see is what Alexis is referring to. Reports are not there. And so when James Wright Foley goes into he was the first fellow that was beheaded a month or so, 2 months ago, goes in to file a story in a local internet cafe. He's doing that because he doesn't have the resources to have his own satellite dish that he can send his material directly. He's got to walk into an internet cafe. In that part of the world are to be. I can remember being in them 9/11, and there would be young kids looking at footage of coming down in New York with glee. Anyway, the supports are very important to have. I feel very comfortable working with Frontline and the kind of we have, but I'm very fortunate that I am able to have that kind of support, that kind of insurance, that kind of rescue protocols that are set up, communication.
I think it's not an understatement to say this is the most dangerous time for journalists in the world right now to do this type of reporting, and we've just seen a huge escalation in atrocities, basically, against journalists. So one of the things about Frontline is we don't do a lot of these stories, so we bet on a few very sophisticated people to go into these places that we trust, we have a long history with. And like Marty said, the reason David called Marty, he's inspired to actually report on ISIS. He also called Marty because he knew we could trust a place like this as safely as possible. So we get pitched, as you guys can imagine, from amazing people all the time, inspired, young, incredible people. And sometimes we use them, really do surround them with support, but we don't do it a lot. So you won't see us do 10 stories on Syria. You'll see us do 2 or 3 because that's what we can afford to do it right. We take it seriously.
So just getting back to ISIS and their methods, you have some. There are some sort of people talking on your in your film about the imagery of ISIS, and you have somebody. I just wrote down this quote. You'll know who it is, but while I was watching, killing is as important to ISIS as the caliphate.
That was Dexter Filkins of The New Yorker, also author of The Forever War, who made the point that this kind of bloodlust that you see is psychosis, as he says. There's no other word for it. And there's no political platform that justifies it. That was a statement that really stuck with me, because you have to try to then of why rationally Abu Bakr Baghdadi, who is the titular head of ISIS, would promote and so proudly distribute it on Twitter and on YouTube. You can spend hours a day looking at what they download onto through these channels, and they're very sophisticated in terms of getting alternate routes and keeping it up there. Google or the others try to take them down. I think what they're trying to do is they're trying, and it is rational, they're terrorizing anybody that would take them on. And they have effectively frightened the Iraqi security forces. A not committed force. We spent a lot of money over there, but what we couldn't give the Iraqis was true heart, which was a belief in Iraq as a nation. They're still very secular, and when Sunni fighters of ISIS use this kind of violence, the Shia fighters in the army and the police run. it's worked for them. And so we'll see more of it as we have in just the last day, more executions.
Right. There was an intelligence report that came out in conjunction with your film, the
Soufan Group.
Yes, and there was a very interesting quote that I thought was very relevant to the sort of tactics that ISIS uses, and I'm just sort of abridging some of this intro. It said the group's use of decentralized media to spread highly produced imagery made supporters their own ministry of propaganda, with a consistent message of reaching its target audience of disaffected youth. I mean, that sort of touches on both the kind of media aspect of what they're doing and the kind of people that they are wooing to their cause. I wonder if you could sort of speak about that from the...
Well, they've been very sophisticated. We hail the internet as a great tool, and then we forget that our enemies will also find it to be a great tool, and they have advanced the ball in this arena. The cameras that they buy, the equipment, and even their sort of editing taste. I don't know how to put it. I mean, their ability to manipulate images is just far beyond what we ever saw with Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri, and they're sort of sitting on a carpet outside a cave in a crude video. We've come a long way in the last 13, 14 years. And, this isn't just ISIS now. I've seen these highly polished videos coming out of North Africa, northern Nigeria. I've seen them coming out of Yemen. There is a greater infrastructure at work here than, and I don't know how much the CIA has plumbed its threat. I've asked myself the question, why would this kind of ultra-violence and these appeals be so popular and draw 3 young women from Denver, or a fellow from Florida willing to be a suicide bomber, or so many of the that have joined? I think it's about being part of something larger and about having something to follow. People that are disaffected, perhaps they don't know much about the news and they're reached through this propaganda, and it's very appealing. I can join something. It's a kind of utopia over there,
Right.
and it's us against the world. They can't. They've threatened now. I read a story the other day that the British fighters that have joined want to go. Some of them want to go home, and they are not allowed. They'll be killed. Amazingly, you can Skype people inside Mosul or inside Raqqa, their capital in Syria, that are living there, and have a conversation with them. They won't show their face, but you can have an audio conversation. Get a picture of what it's like.
So how much what is drawing people and how much is just something sort of sensational?
Wow. I think, if you polled a bunch of ISIS fighters, you'd find a lot of different motivations. I think there's just a lot of different reasons for why this might appeal. I remember looking at one videotape, and it was a training camp. And these are young kids that are, crawling on their bellies under barbed wire and then climbing over a jungle gym and swinging from ropes over a body of water. And it kind of looked like, ecotourism to somebody. It was kind of like a day at the gym. And then they slaughtered a goat, and everybody had a big plate of food with rice and goat meat. And I think if I'm from Turkmenistan or some backwater of our world that and face this future, this might really appeal to me. Mm-hmm. Also remember that until they started fighting for the control of Kobani, they really didn't face much in the way of combat. Mm-hmm. They really pushed on an open door as the Iraqi army fled. And so they're now facing it's starting to feel like a war, I think, to a lot of these guys, and some of them want out.
We have another clip.
Yeah, we do have a clip. This is the film. Again, I'm sorry, I didn't select a clip that shows more of the sort of on-the-ground work in Iraq and Syria. This is another more Washington-centric piece, but it, I think, is asking the question that is lines, and that is, what kind of threat are they?
ISIS is an immediate threat to our interests
comforting with the limiting principle as it pertains to troops on the ground. You figure out what that means. I think the difficulty here is that they've declared a goal and then put limits on what they can achieve that goal. It's kind of like if you tie one hand behind your back and try to fight Sugar Ray Leonard. You've said you're going to beat him, but you're going to tie one hand behind your back. It's a slippery slope. I'm not advocating that we in this. We were simply trying what the men at the top of the government, these two guys, are thinking about this. Very sensitive about this exchange. Called me two or three times a couple of days before air.
Really? Obviously, I've seen from some of the comments on Facebook and on Twitter that there are people who follow this who were surprised by some of the details that you brought out in this documentary. What surprised you in working on this story?
A number of things surprised me. One is that Dempsey was very clear that the trigger for beginning of the U.S. air campaign was not a humanitarian issue. Yazidis stranded in Sinjar without food or water, or the threats ISIS was making and Shabaks and other northern Iraq. But it was threat to U.S. personnel in the capital of Kurdistan, Erbil, which means about $1 trillion of investments from Chevron and Royal Dutch Shell, Total, other big ones from the West. That was one big surprise. I was surprised by the fact that there were more than a year-long peaceful demonstrations in the Sunni communities that preceded the emergence of ISIS. I was not aware of that. I had, like the president, kind of turned my back, as much of the country had, on what was going on in the country. I had worked on other things, the financial crisis stories, the NSA story. So when I came back and started reading up before this last trip, I was surprised how hard the community had tried to turn Maliki around, to try to participate in the government. Many of them had joined the government, but the purges were unbearable for so many of them for so long. So those were two of many surprises that you'll see if you get a chance to watch.
Right. Raney, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you are engaging viewers, readers, kinds of things that you're doing at Frontline. This is just such important work, and you yourselves are using new media and new ways of communicating.
One of the greatest things about Frontline is it's always been a digital company, digital news organization, and David has always believed fully in streaming these films the moment that he could get them on the web. And I mean, that was 2000. These films were streaming. So we've always been in out. In other words, other news organizations really didn't, and we really felt we always should have as much out there as possible. I think what's changed recently is that we have just exploded online. Terms for Facebook, Twitter, but also we're starting a big partnership with YouTube. And the reason we're doing that is, well, we have a audience digitally. We really want to reach younger people as well. And so we see a differentiation between our audiences. We see different audiences watching us in different places. And our ethos is to go where people are, where they are, and they happen to be in millions on YouTube. And it was a kind of dramatic decision, and PBS was behind us, which is remarkable and really says how much things have changed, that they're just mostly interested in how do we capture younger people. I think the great news, and a lot of you guys have students, so you know this already, is Well, this millennial crowd is passionate about international news. When we watch them engage with us online, they really care. I mean, they engage, they send us comments, they're angry, they're sad. They actually express themselves in a way that we don't see often with our broadcast traditional audience. The other thing is they watch for a long time. So on YouTube, even though we've just started this partnership with YouTube, we will see that people will literally stay for the entire we put up, and we put up our most serious stuff. We made a decision as a series to not dumb down what we're telling it a little bit differently. We have a whole range of correspondence, but the amazing thing is that younger people are absorbing it and engaging, and then some of them we hope will come and watch our longer form as well. So this is a big shift for us, and we're also looking at many, and you all know this, fast technology is moving. So we are looking at new technologies of how we can help younger people find our work. So immersive technologies to engage with them. And some of that area is incredibly exciting to me, who care about storytelling and making sure that we can continue to do this kind of work. It's really important.
Great. Well, I would like to open this up for questions. There are plenty of questions, we have a microphone that will come around, and gentleman who's in the striped shirt, who happens to be
by coincidence. The hardest thing to do in the medium that you've discussed is to talk about what's on minds. As I understand it, from having heard last night's broadcast and also with my independent study on the matter, the idea of al-Baghdadi's declaring a caliphate to an observant Sunni is an obligation. It's something that observant Sunni has to swear allegiance to. And inasmuch as the majority of the Muslim world is Sunni, and inasmuch as so much money and so much effort goes into this, and the caliphate was, of course, abolished by the Turks in the mid-20s, there's been an urge to put it back, and now it's there. And now someone has given a name to it and a geography to it. What is it going to mean in terms of our looking at this as Westerners? It's fine to fight against it, but this is an idea, and it's far deeper than anything that simply overcoming military forces is going to accomplish.
Last night we had a screening party apartment, and a number of Iraqi friends had come over to the house. And I got into a conversation with one of them after the program about the caliphate and its attraction to especially Salafi, hardcore fundamentalist Islamists. And he said that what impressed him most in listening to the entire speech that Baghdadi made at the Great Mosque in Mosul after they took it over, a really audacious event that he decides to stand up in this mosque. And he said that Baghdadi was very sophisticated in terms of using phrases that had been used hundreds of years ago by caliphs. And this is not lost on a lot of imams around the Sunni world. And you're absolutely right. This is an idea, and it's an idea with tremendous magnetism. And as one person points out in the program, and you heard them, said if only 1% of the world's Sunni Muslims fall seriously, you're talking about tens of thousands. ISIS grew from a handful of a couple of dozen guys to 5,000 within 1 year, and now 30,000 is the estimate. Many of them, as we were saying, for different reasons. But, I'm not a historian that can say much more, but you're absolutely right that this is a powerful idea, and you can take out ISIS, but you have to somehow find a way to address the condition. You have to discredit the idea. You have to come to terms with the conditions that give rise to a group like ISIS. And that won't be eradicated by killing them.
Caliphate. The Turkish government seems to have greater animosity to the Kurds than to ISIS. And with this idea of the caliphate, it actually would mean overthrow of Turkey, because dealing with the Islamic world, the boundaries grow in terms of history.
Turks have a pretty good army engaged in defending themselves. They just have been sitting on the sidelines because they're happy to see Turks and Sunni ISIS members kill each other. It's kind of like our willingness to sit back and watch the Iranians and the Iraqis kill each other for 10 years. I mean, they're just, I mean, I know I sound very hard-boiled and cynical when I say that, but I mean that the truth is that distrust the Kurds, they distrust ISIS, just let them have each other, and we'll watch from the hilltop. That's been largely their position. They've gotten somewhat involved.
Right. Well, you have literal imagery of that. Yes. Question in the back.
Short comment and then a question to Mr. Smith. The comment is in response to the earlier speaker. As an observant, I would like to assure him and others that the 40 Islamic scholars who took issue using the doctrinal and Quranic literature to criminalize every tactic used by ISIS is far more representative of the millions of Muslims of the world. And while 1% could adhere to the twisted and views and tactics of ISIS, the overwhelming Islamic scholarship and Islamic leadership rejects and as unacceptable and criminal. And Martin was correct in referring to them as psychotic criminals, and that is fundamentally what they are.
Thank you for that comment. That's important to make that point. Thank you.
And but the question that and I think the media, if I might add, has a duty to give, if not greater coverage to those voices to ensure a balanced and more accurate portrayal of the threat, because we give too much importance to ISIS neither being Islamic nor a state, but by emphasizing their voices, we actually give them greater power, not just a greater potential for threat and terrorism. They're succeeding by usurping the majority of the coverage. So by giving coverage to these other voices, we actually put them in their proper context and in the diminutive position that they should be in. As a military threat, I think those who in the lead up to the 2003 war, and this is where the question comes in, warned that you take the lid off of the Sunni-Shiite fight by removing Saddam Hussein as a fulcrum between Iran and Syria, and sort of opening up that Pandora's box, that it would be inevitable by removing a Sunni stronghold in the middle of these two Iranian Shiite strongholds, we create a Sunni-Shiite conflict. So it was predicted as quite inevitable, and it should come as no surprise that the disenfranchised Baathists, the disenfranchised Sunnis, and fueled by the jihadi rage that is in the region and the rage that the aggression in 2003 took place, that this combination combined with the psychotic criminality that it comes with and the disaffected youth that find this appealing will create what ISIS is today. And the only way to combat them is to reverse the ideological underpinnings, the disaffected swamp that they come from, and to address them as what they are, criminals. They're not a state and they're not Islamic.
When they changed their name to the Islamic State, I said to David and Raney, let's just call them ISIS. I'm not going so far as to give them the Islamic State as a moniker. Mm-hmm. Listen, all your points are well taken. I think if you watch the documentary, I don't know if you have, we spend a lot of time talking to moderate Sunnis, centrists, yes, who were marginalized, persecuted by Maliki. Right, we have to pay attention, and those you're bringing up, but we tend as a society not to pay attention to anything unless there's a crisis. That's just human nature. We have so many things to focus on. So we are focused on ISIS as an immediate threat to the region, to the border of Iraq and Syria, to Iraqis, to Syrians. But if you see the documentary, it is rooted in an understanding of the Sunni community, the reasonable Sunnis that were marginalized, that then became the sort of platform that ISIS could infiltrate and exploit.
Just to add to that is we spent a lot of time in the edit room really discussing what images to use, and a lot of this is image based, right? And they love to use images, as we were talking about before. That is their propaganda. So you'll see these films and you won't see a lot of it, but you'll see a little of it, and other media will go way over do everything. And these are the kind of discussions we have at Frontline. Like, how much do we show? How much do we give them a platform to actually spread their propaganda? And so I loved your comments. Thank you.
Yes. Could somebody turn off their phone? I think that seems to be. Thank you.
Unfortunately, for the moderate Muslims, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is a brilliant man who is pushing all the right buttons in imitating what the Prophet Muhammad did as a military leader. So all the decapitations, Prophet Muhammad decapitated 900 Jews, Kanuka in Medina, taking women as slaves and then and taking them as concubines for the troops. That's what the Prophet did. So he is doing so many things a religious must not deny, because if they deny what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is doing, they're denying what the Prophet did. So it is a big problem, but Muslims are going to prevail and ultimately change. Well, I hope they can change a little Islam. So all the best of luck.
I think that what hangs in the balance is which way the Sunni tribes are going to go in this battle. That some of them are on the fence, some of them are still undecided as to whether or not they want to give up on ISIS because they're worried about what the Shia-led government will do to them. It's like if you have a gun held at my head, you don't want to put it down until you're sure I've been disarmed. You're absolutely right, though, about Baghdadi. He knows what he's doing. I don't know where he learned it. What's that?
In prison.
He was in Camp Bucca, an American-run prison, and he hung out with a lot of other Islamists there and met a lot of Baathists, and they found common cause.
Right. Question here in the front. Can we get a microphone?
The word Quran has not been mentioned. And is there an issue here when you want to discredit a movement that you also have to look at the underlying text? And is anyone thinking about taking the Quran to task to some extent in terms of some of the injunctions it calls for on the part of Muslims?
Mm-hmm.
Hello? Can you hear?
We've had a couple of comments here that are referring to Baghdadi's knowledge of what the Prophet said, and those are obviously reference passages in the Quran and what we know about Muhammad. I'm not a scholar of the Quran. Somehow my instincts are that going at the Quran directly is not the way to get the attention of even moderate Muslims. You can say the same thing about the Bible.
Good point. Question here?
Hi. So my question relates to the officials you spoke with, the Iraqis. I watched Frontline last night, so I noted that you spoke with a gentleman who I assume no longer works at Maliki, but he was talking about how Maliki's behavior as far as Sunnis. And you also spoke with members of the current administration, Rhodes and Dempsey, but I consider the DOD to be a bit of a separate entity as far as not speaking for the administration per se. But my question is, did any of those parties speak to you about this so-called intelligence failure that Obama cited as as a reasoning for why supposedly the U.S. government was taken by surprise by the upsurgence of ISIS as a threat overall and specifically to the United States, because obviously it's well documented that there were uprisings, there were protests, there were punitive actions taken by the Maliki government against Sunnis. The handwriting was clearly on the wall, so there's no need for, quote, intelligence to dictate what is apparent to anyone who was paying attention.
You're absolutely right. It was very clear, and Ben Rhodes in the White House acknowledges that there were no intelligence failures when it came to the gathering storm that was Iraq in 2012, 13, and this year. The failure that caught them by surprise, this is what Ben Rhodes said to me, and it's not in the documentary, we didn't get everything we wanted in, was in really understanding how rotten the Iraqi security forces were. We didn't have U.S. advisors on the ground. We had nobody there that could really say the barracks are, half empty or worse, that the army full of ghost soldiers. These were soldiers that were on paper only. The commanders would get the budget and pocket the difference because they didn't have to feed and house and pay so many soldiers. So what the White House told me was that they did not understand how weak. They knew that ISIS was a gathering threat, but they didn't really Mosul. Now that's a hard one because Fallujah had fallen early this year in January. So there's a lot of reason that we should keep debating that as to just where the failures were. Well, I don't think they're happy that they missed that. I mean, they're not defending it as... again, the president didn't trust Maliki as a partner. He had trouble engaging with him. His promises weren't worth anything. And two, he did not consider... This is what Panetta kept telling me, that when he would go to the president with warnings of various kinds, the word he got back from Obama was that Obama didn't perceive this as an imminent threat to the United States, and that's what he's charged with protecting, the United States.
Gentleman in the back, yes.
If we could go back to the president for a minute, do you think that his reluctance to engage initially in the Syrian civil war is due to the fragility of the anti-Assad coalition, their lack of unity, there's no other word for it, their lack of competence, both and politically and diplomatically?
It's, the short answer to that is certainly, yes. He was fragility of it. He was worried about the lack of bright lines between jihadist radicals and so-called moderate Sunnis. This is a very fluid situation. Not Sunnis, I'm sorry. Well, they were Sunnis, but jihadists and the more moderate forces, so-called pro-Western rebels. It's a very fluid situation in which this week I work for this commander because he's paying more and he's got a battle plan to go here or there, and the next time I'm working for another guy. And even among the commanders, there was a lot of collaboration between hardline extremists and more moderate rebels. The president, I'm sure, was getting those briefings and was very worried about, as Panetta said in one of the clips, where the weapons would end up. I think it's unfortunately it's Monday morning quarterbacking as to Had we armed the moderate Syrian rebels, however that was possible, would it have prevented ISIS from growing? That's the theory. And I think it's important to put that out there. I think that's a defensible position, but so is the president's position.
I think we have time for two more questions. Gentleman in the blue shirt. Sorry.
I'm surprised that there are only 30,000 ISIS troops, and I think I had heard that before, but it is somewhat shocking that we can't get Saudi Arabia, Turkey, even Iran, someone, and United States to really defeat a 30,000 member military. Do you have any sense that we are gaining some ground in that area, and whether or not the other Middle Eastern countries will help out?
I don't remember, but how many Hamas fighters were there in Gaza when Israel was trying to root them out of there? What's happened is that this is doing the same thing. They're melting into the cities. They're setting up in places where a bomb obviously have collateral damage and kill women and children and innocent men. So it's, yeah, maybe it's simple, but if they can hide among the population, they can successfully prevent us from striking them. There's reasons why we've dropped so many bombs around Kobani and still have not been able to move them out of there, because we're not willing to just strafe the carpet bomb the whole place, destroy it to save it. I don't know even how reliable that 30,000 is. It might be 40,000, it might be 20. These are CIA official estimates, and we don't know exactly. But a few guys with guns amongst a civilian population are hard to get out.
One more question in the back.
Thank you very much, and for coming here and everything. Well, first, before I wanted to ask a question in regards to a lot of the situations or questions I've heard in regards to Baghdadi's influence of using Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. I think it is merely, just as he was in prison, is a political movement to gather that many people in regards to use of religion. We saw it many times in history. And in regards to the people in Medina, it was more of a political threat. That it was an invasion. It was something they had to do to defend. Nonetheless, that's not my point. My main question is regards to ISIS as being in Iraq and Syria. Do you think that it's a possibility that it would spread not only west but east towards Afghanistan, where there's already a bit of instability, and towards Pakistan in that region, or will it be more towards Palestine or towards Europe?
Well, you can inspire movements. Been a split in the Taliban of Pakistan, and one group has pledged allegiance now to ISIS. So, they can't spread across Iran, which stands between them and Afghanistan. But in Pakistan, again, that's a very interesting development, and they have stated their move into, and there are reports that they've moved across the border. Those are their ambitions. I think what the bombing campaigns can do is can slow them down. But I think after that, it is persuading the Turks and the Saudis to get active in going after them. They're unwilling to do that. They don't really have that kind of combat experience.
Giving me the signal. And so I want to think here, they're just been fantastic.